Hi, everybody. I was listening to a video on my ride home from work today, and the video had David Wood interviewing Bart Ehrman. And I found the video pretty interesting, and I thought that a few of the points that were made were good. But then I thought that there were some points that were made by the atheist or agnostic, whatever he calls himself, Bart Ehrman, that I think need a little bit more clarification. Somebody needs to address some of the points he sort of flippantly made, which I think were quite erroneous. These had to do with things such as the gospel reliability and what the core tenets of the gospel say and how that relates to whether or not we're justified in believing in the Bible and that sort of thing. So what we're going to do today is we are going to take a look at that video, and we're going to discuss some of the flaws that were in it. And because I find that kind of stuff to do very good. And so I want to say hi to my friend Josh right there, the Christian Resistance. So welcome to see you. He's been posting a lot of stuff on Twitter lately. And I have to say, Josh has been quite a good friend. And so I'm very glad to see him in the chat. So thank you for showing up, Josh. And also thank you for showing up here, Slam RN. So great to see you too. Another great friend, Susan, and Taking Back Eden. So all my good friends, besties. So you guys, thank you so much. You're going to like this video because I really like David Wood. Now, David Wood is a Christian, in case you don't know, and he spends a lot of his time debating Muslims because he is very well versed on the Quran, which I am not. So I don't spend much time debating on the Muslim faith. In fact, I just don't know enough about the Muslim faith to spend any time debating on it. But beyond that, here we go. Let's take a look here at this particular video, and we're going to not watch the entire thing because it's an hour long, and I think there's some stuff that isn't as interesting, but we're going to watch the interesting stuff, the interesting parts of the video. And so without further ado, let me just catch us over there. All right. So now you can see this video. Make sure I've got the volume here full force. Yes, we do. Make sure you can hear that nicely. And again, this is at the bottom there, you've got Bart Ehrman on the left, David Wood on the right. Now, what they're talking about here is an upcoming debate on April 9th between Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona. Mike Licona, I've had on my channel before. He's a nice guy. He's a Christian. He tends to lean a little bit to the left in Christianity, if I would call him a more liberal Christian, with respect to his views on the Bible and its authenticity. He thinks there are some insertions, and he also posits different authorship. But beyond that, he is going to be debating very soon. So let's listen to what they have to say and what these two both agreed on with respect to Jesus' mythicism. Now, again, mythicism is the belief, and it varies. People vary on their beliefs and exactly what mythicism is. But some believe Jesus didn't even exist, which Bart Ehrman pretty much laughs at. He is a North Carolina New Testament scholar, and he was raised apparently in the Episcopalian faith. He ended up in having a born-again experience, he said, in his teens. He came to be an evangelical Christian. And then due to the problem of evil, he tossed it all away, kicked it to the curb, and now he says he's an agnostic atheist. So here we go. And David Wood was raised, he was an atheist, actually, and he came to Christianity after he looked at the evidence and he realized how his character aligned with the character of Jesus. And if anyone could forgive him for some of the things that he had done in his past, which are pretty bad, I'll say that for sure. If anyone could forgive him, it was Jesus. And he does a really nice video on how he came to Christianity. And I have to say that that's really compelling. There are a lot of good, compelling reasons to come to Christianity. So let's listen to a few comments here. Here we go.
Statements on your perspective, but down towards the bottom, I think I saw a statement that was from both of you. And down at the bottom here, it says, whether you are a believer, fundamentalist, evangelical, moderate, liberal, or a non-believer, Jesus is the most significant individual in the history of our civilization. Coming to understand who Jesus actually was and what he actually did and did not do is one of the most important intellectual endeavors anyone in our society can embark upon. But then it's got Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Mike Licona underneath it. So is that both of your perspectives?
Well, certainly my perspective. I mean, I'm not a believer, but I mean, who could deny that Jesus is the most important figure in the history of civilization? I mean, there are 2 billion people, over 2 billion people who worship him. Who else can you say that about, a human being?
So here's a point where I completely agree with Dr. Bart Ehrman. In fact, I said something quite similar earlier today on my Twitter feed. And so they just very much in alignment. So we're in agreement here. One rare time.
And so, no. I mean, Jesus is incredibly important, and I'm completely committed to understanding who the historical Jesus was, and about his life, and what his teachings were. And so I'm completely committed to that because of the supreme importance of it. I agree. I don't think I wrote that statement, but I would completely agree with it.
And just in the name of full disclosure, I've known Mike for over 20 years, so I will be rooting for Mike during this debate. And so we'll all watch it, and I'm sure we'll all have an awesome time.
Yeah, and I will be rooting for Mike. I have seen Mike debate Bart Ehrman before, and I do think that he does concede a few too many points. I will say that. So I'm going to zoom ahead to where I find another rather interesting comment so I can make some commentary on things that I think are incorrect that Dr. Ehrman has to say. So here we go.
All right. Now, so we talked about the Jesus mythers. So on the issue of the historical Jesus, so a Christian would generally go to the Bible, look at the Gospels, and say, here's where I get my beliefs about Jesus. As someone who doesn't believe in the divine inspiration of the text, you've got, the books of the New Testament, which were originally circulating by themselves. And then you have sources outside the New Testament. And then you have, second century sources and so on. I'm not sure there can be any sort of official ranking now, but as someone, if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe in Jesus, but is trying to do what you said in the statement on the site, that, hey, we should learn about Jesus, what would be like your go-to sources to learn about Jesus?
Well, the only useful sources are the four Gospels.
So I disagree with that. I think the four Gospels, of course, are excellent sources to learn about the life and time and missionary work and ministry of Jesus. However, I do think that we can get a lot of information about him also in Acts. Of course, Acts gives us a lot of information. The fact that Jesus appeared to Paul in Acts. Now, a lot of people like to talk about the road to Damascus that Paul talks about 3 times in Acts. The Acts is said to be written by Luke. It was written after Luke was written. But the interesting thing about the book of Acts is Jesus also appears later to Paul. In fact, if you go to Acts 23:11, here's what you'll see. And some people forget this, and they also forget that he appeared another time also to Paul. It says the following night, this is Acts 23:11. Now, this is also when Paul was having trouble. It says, and when the dissension, this is Acts 23:10. And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by then, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him to the barracks. Quote, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so must you testify also in Rome. And so he also appeared to Paul a couple of times after the road to Damascus. So we have that information. So we also can say that we can go within the Bible. This is, of course, within the Bible. But then you could also talk about going outside of the Bible, because we have a lot of the early church fathers who quoted the Bible and who also wrote about the Bible. And of course, they wrote about the life of Jesus. So you can certainly go to them. You can learn more about the crucifixion, the resurrection, all that kind of stuff as well. And then Paul talks about Jesus's character quite a bit. In fact, making mention, of course, of the most important out of faith, love, hope, and which one's the most important? Love. Talks about how important love is, talks how important faith is in many verses, just really giving us insight, even more insight than we have before, on the character of Jesus. So if you want to read about Jesus' character, not only do the Gospels count, but you definitely would want to go outside of the Gospels and look at what some of the other early writers had to say.
We have some Gospels from later. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, and they might give us a scrap or two, but basically nothing. And there are no Roman sources that mention Jesus in the entire first century, no Greek or Roman sources outside of the Christian sources and Josephus. Josephus mentions a couple of things, but he doesn't give us anything that's not already in the Gospels.
Oops, wrong. No, Josephus actually told us about the fate of Jesus's half-brother, James. So Josephus let us know, we know that James was in the temple. This is not something that we find the details on, with the fate of Jesus's half-brother, James. What happened was James was in the temple in Jerusalem and he was preaching, and eventually he ended up being martyred. And Josephus is the one who shares that information with us. And so that is not in there. So then, of course, that also speaks to the idea of the Jesus mythicist, because of course, if Jesus had a brother, Jesus had to be alive, silly mythicist. So, I mean, seriously.
And so for anybody doing the historical Jesus, there's no option. You go with the Gospels. But the historian doesn't treat them as inspired sources in the sense that every word they say is historically accurate, because there's good reasons for knowing that, in fact, they're not always accurate.
We disagree on that.
As Mike Licona himself says, by the way.
And Mike Licona, as I mentioned earlier, does take some liberties, unfortunately, with the New Testament.
So if you take that approach, not taking them as inspired, and you're looking at them as basically historical documents, and as an atheist, I'm assuming you wouldn't believe in that Jesus actually performed miracles and so on. So what would you say, based on the documents that we have available to us, what would you say that we can know about Jesus?
I think we know a lot about him, about what he said and did, because when whoever.
One problem, and one thing that I've worked myself to address, and I especially do this because I teach a business class in communication to MBA students each summer. One of the things I want to address always is the filler words. And you can see, unfortunately, Dr. Ehrman has not really addressed his use of filler words. You hear a lot of and and I have had that problem myself. I think we all have that problem, but it's something that you really work on to correct. Here we go.
Whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew did not think he was writing the Bible. He was writing an account of Jesus' life.
Notice how he slipped something in there on whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew. We have a lot of internal evidence that Matthew, the tax collector, wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Some of that evidence is the fact that Matthew is the only one who reports the drachma incident, where Peter and Jesus had a drachma in a fish, and that drachma was used to pay the taxes. And so I can just point that out as something that you might want to note. But there is also a lot of internal evidence that Matthew wrote it. And of course, nobody in ancient times attributed the four Gospels to anybody but the named authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. The attributions were not to anyone else. And so to say that is a modern notion.
And his teachings, his activities, and his death and resurrection. So the historian uses that, just like the historian would use a source for Napoleon or Julius Caesar. I mean, it's somebody's favorably inclined. Plutarch, writing a biography, is inclined to appreciate this person's writing about usually, and so you use it with that in mind. So I've written a lot over the years about what we can say about what Jesus said and did. My first book for a general audience was just on that question. How does a historian approach these sources? And the view that's been around, I'll tell you, my views of Jesus actually today are not different from my views when I was a Christian scholar. Not when I was a fundamentalist or a conservative evangelical, but when I started teaching at Chapel Hill, I was a Christian, went to church every week, taught adult education, but I did not think that Jesus went around calling himself God. I thought that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet.
One of the problems, and Nabil Qureshi has addressed this. Nabil Qureshi is a Muslim who passed away not too long ago, unfortunately, and he was also a good friend of David Wood. But Nabil Qureshi was also a student of Bart Ehrman, and he pointed to Bart Ehrman that, of course, Jesus did make that claim. He pointed out the verses around Mark 14:62, where the Pharisees approached Jesus and they asked him if he was the Son of the Most High. And he said, I am, and you will see the Son of the Mighty One sitting at the right hand and coming in the clouds of heaven. He made direct references to Psalm 110 that talks about sitting at the right hand of the Father. It's sitting at the right hand of the Father. And the important part about that is it gives Jesus an equal level to the Father. And he also referenced Daniel 7, coming in the clouds of heaven. And so we've got a couple of references there packed into that verse, which would be quite clear to Jewish people in ancient times what he was saying. And that is why the Pharisees ripped off their clothes and demanded that he be crucified, because they thought that he was saying he was God, which quite clearly he was. He is. That's the point.
somebody who predicted that, someone who believed that this world is controlled by forces of evil. That's
Let me point out, I'm sorry if I misspoke. Isaac, thank you so much. Nabil Qureshi was a Christian when he passed away. He was originally a Muslim. He came to Christianity. And actually, I would just mention really quickly a little portion of his story that I enjoy so much. What happened to Nabil is he wanted to know the truth, and he kept praying to God, and he really wanted to know the truth. And he knew how difficult it would be to leave the Muslim faith. To be a Muslim apostate is a very difficult time for you and your family. And in some places in the world, of course, you can be killed for that. But Nabil knew it'd be very difficult, especially because he had grandparents and relatives who had also been quite involved in ministry and in sharing the apologetics of the Muslim faith. But what happened is he had a dream one night that he was sitting at the outside of a banquet. And at the banquet, he saw his friend David Wood. And it was a great banquet, and it was a small door that was there. And he looked over and he thought to himself, he really wanted to be in this banquet. And he wondered, he said, I would really like to be in this banquet. How can I get in the banquet? And David Wood looked at him and he said, you've been offered the invitation, but you haven't accepted. And when Nabil woke up, he called David Wood and he told him the story. And of course, David Wood referred to the great banquet story in the Gospels and how there was a great banquet and then suddenly the master comes and closes the door. The offer was out there, but Nabil hadn't accepted. After that, Nabil accepted. So thank you. I want to say hi also to everybody else in the chat. Evidence and Reasons. Good to see you. Keith Colvin, Isaac Lelahar, Taking Back Eden, Slam. And great to see all you guys. Keith, yes, I've got Keith Colvin too. So great. Here we go.
That's why there's so many awful things happening that we often can't explain, is because there are evil powers in control of this world. And Jesus, as a Jewish person at the time, really thought that. And he also thought that God was ready to intervene to change the entire created order, because he was going to get rid of these forces of evil. He was going to destroy everything opposed to him, including everybody opposed to him, and bring in a good kingdom here on earth that would be ruled by God through his Messiah.
Now, if you want further details on that, of course, we can find that in the book of Revelation. So in the book of Revelation, we can see exactly that story playing out. We see the New Jerusalem. We see the streets made of gold. We see all kinds of different jewels and beauty surrounding the place. And that's where only the children of God will be. And God will be his leader. He will be our God. It's going to be a wonderful situation. Now, when Jesus talked about this generation, we're still in the end times right now. We're still part of the Genea, or generation, which Jesus referred to. And so to try to say that Jesus thought that this was all going to be ushered in and there would be a physical kingdom is being slightly irresponsible with the information that's provided.
And Jesus was expecting this to happen, and he thought it would happen in his own generation.
And we are again in this generation. Now, you have to remember something. The Population Reference Bureau has estimated that around 108 billion people have walked the planet. Interestingly, they estimate that about 57% of those people walked it after 1 AD. Now, why that's interesting is because the planet has been around for a long time. And so to have the majority of people only in the last 2,000 years speaks volumes. So here we go.
And so that was the heart of his message. As he says throughout the entire Synoptic Gospels, that's what he preaches. Jesus in the early sources, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, does not go around saying, believe in my death and resurrection for your salvation, which became the Christian message. Jesus says, repent because the kingdom of God is at hand. You need to repent and prepare for this kingdom that's coming. And he meant kingdom.
So the perception is, of course, we are in the kingdom of God. Now, if you go to the book of Daniel, if you haven't really looked into that, you're going to find there's 4 kingdoms that Daniel referenced. Now, Daniel was written in the 6th century BC when Daniel, the prophet, was under Babylonian captivity. And he talked about the kingdom of Babylonia, the Babylonian kingdom. He had started that. He was under King Nebuchadnezzar in that. He also mentioned the Medo-Persian kingdom, which started in 539 BC with King Cyrus and Darius the Mede. He also spoke of the Greek kingdom, interestingly, that didn't come about until the mid-4th century BC. So hundreds of years later, Alexander came in. He spoke of the four components of the Greek kingdom, which of course were the 4 kings who ended up taking over after Alexander the Great died. And then he spoke of the final kingdom, the one where Christianity was going to be ushered in. He didn't say Christianity, of course, but he said the one that where the Messiah, the anointed one, would be cut off. And that, of course, took place in the Roman Empire. We are the part of the, I mean, we're among the, coming out of the Roman Empire, the entire Christian world sort of began. So in the Roman Empire, centered there was the Catholic Church that was around for many years before the Protestants came in the 16th century. But anyway, keep going. Here we go.
He didn't mean heaven. He meant like a kingdom of God here, as other Jews meant.
And let's remember, the kingdom of heaven is in your midst, or the kingdom of heaven is within you. Jesus also made that quite clear. So this world can be heaven or hell depending on your perceptions. I think C.S. Lewis said something like that. He talked about the heaven is, aim at heaven and you get the earth thrown in, aim at earth and you get neither.
And so I think Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet expecting the end to come soon.
Is there anything, like if you were to make like a little bullet list of things that you would say as a historian that who doesn't believe in divine inspiration, if there were like a bullet list of other things that you agreed or that you could know about Jesus, anything else? So apocalypse.
Well, lots of things. I mean, I think, you know, we can verify. I think there are criteria that historians use for anything. If you want to know about the life of Abraham Lincoln and you've got a bunch of sources, you've got to figure out how to use the sources. And so we use the same criteria for doing the historical Jesus. And when you apply those, there are all sorts of things that Jesus said that he probably said. There are some things that you think, yeah, he probably didn't say that. Same with Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. And there are things that he did. I mean, he
says these things and he expects it's just going to kind of fly over us without us noticing what he's saying. Now, you have to put yourself into the shoes of the early writers of the New Testament. These were men who believed very firmly and faithfully in the divinity of Jesus. They're not going to just go out there and take a bunch of liberties with the text and make up words that Jesus said. You would not do that. If you're a believer, you don't do that. If I actually met Jesus and Jesus said certain things to me, I'm not going to go take a bunch of liberties to make it sound like he's more divine than he really is. He is divine. I'm going to tell the full truth of exactly what happened. And we see that played out in the Gospels, especially. We see that Jesus' brothers tried to stop his ministry. We see that they thought he was crazy. We see a lot of little truths in there that the gospel authors weren't trying to sell the case. They were trying to tell us the truth. It's quite clear.
Certainly baptized by John the Baptist, in my judgment. He had a preaching ministry when he's preaching the coming kingdom. He had 12 disciples around him. He spent most of his time up in Galilee. He was preaching to the people who had listened to him. He had 12 disciples. He went to Jerusalem at the end of his life. He went during a Passover feast, and he got on the wrong side of the law and was crucified by his opponent. I mean, there's a whole list of things you can say.
And that's true. I want to say, Susan, she says, are you going to pay to watch the debate? Now, I saw it's $39.95 and it's an all-day debate. So it seems like a little painfully long. I can't even imagine a debate that goes for over 8 hours. It sounds like it's something that we definitely want to see some clips of. But it's my understanding that Dr. David Wood will be discussing the debate after the debate. And I don't know if he'll be able to show clips of it in that, but he and the apostate prophet, who apparently is an ex-Muslim atheist, are going to be reviewing the debate after it's over. And so I don't know if they show us clips. I'm not sure if it's worth the money as far as I'm concerned. I have seen Bart Ehrman debate Mike Licona before, and I can't imagine really any more points coming out. But you're right, Susan, we have to figure out how to get access to it, because I would like to discuss it. And I would like to play it. So I have to maybe think about that.
Say that I think are highly probable it's coming from the life of Jesus. And there are a lot of things in the Gospels that you say, yeah, probably not.
And you, I saw in your discussion with the apostate prophet, you said that you think Jesus believed he was the Messiah?
Yes. But not in the sense that Christians say that. But when Christians say Jesus is the Messiah, what they typically mean is that Jesus was the one sent by God to die for the sins of the world and to be raised from the dead. There was no Jew in the days of Jesus who thought that's what the Messiah was going to be. There were no Jews who thought that. The Messiah was going to, they had different.
Of course, Terribly frustrating when you see stuff like this. No Jews who thought, he says this with such authority that you have to think to yourself, he's teaching this to students. He says things like this and you think that he's gone and he's done his homework. And sadly, no, Bart. Now, number one, there's quite a few bits in the Old Testament. I'll admit, until Luke 24, we have the two people who are on the road to Emmaus. Their eyes had to be opened by Jesus to what exactly was in the Old Testament and how it related to him. Other people's eyes had to be open to the Old Testament to see exactly how it related to Jesus. We know the timing of Jesus from Daniel 9 especially. We know that Jesus was going to arrive right around the specific time when he did, because we can backtrack it to anywhere between 457 and 444 BC, when the call to rebuild Jerusalem went out. So we have 77s less 7 after that. We also know that he was going to be appearing in the Second Temple. Now, the Second Temple was destroyed. Malachi 3:1 tells us that. He was going to appear in the Second Temple, which was destroyed in 70. So that also gives us a time frame. We knew that he would have two forms. Now, here's the question that you have to ask Bart Ehrman. Did the early rabbis know that there were two different types of Messiah described in the Old Testament? And yes, guess what? They did know. In fact, we can see that around 500 in the Babylonian Talmud, here's specifically what they say. And this is 500, but this also gives you an early idea of what people thought probably around Jesus' time as well. Rabbi Alexandri says, Rabbi Yahushua ben Levi raises a contradiction between two depictions of the coming of the Messiah. Again, I'm going to Sanhedrin. This is Jewish writing, okay? It is written, there came with the clouds of heaven one like the sun, one like unto a son of man. Now, of course, that is in Daniel 7. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. That's Daniel 7:13-14. And it is written, behold, your king will come to you. He is just and victorious, lowly and riding upon a donkey, and upon a colt, the foal of a donkey. That is in Zechariah 9:9. So they were well aware of this also very humble type of Messiah. Rabbi Alexandria explains, if the Jewish people merit redemption, the Messiah will come in a miraculous manner with the clouds of heaven. If they do not merit redemption, the Messiah will come lowly and riding upon a donkey. So no, Bart, sorry, I know you know this too. That's the thing that kind of gets me. I am sure he knows this.
Expectations of the Messiah. So depending which Jewish sources you're reading, but the most common view is that the Messiah was going to be a descendant of David, who, like David, would be a political figure, a warrior, who drove out the enemy and became the king over a sovereign state of Israel.
And that is one Jewish view. Absolutely. That is the Jewish view that many Jewish people held. They didn't really understand the whole idea of Messiah coming on a donkey. Who rides donkeys anymore? They didn't understand that kind of thing. And so some of them had expectations that he would have a physical kingdom here. Of course, his kingdom began as a spiritual kingdom, the spiritual kingdom of Christianity. Now, Christianity has grown in number. Christians have grown in number ever since the inception. It keeps going up and up and up and up. More Christians as a relative portion of the world keep increasing year after year after year. And so our understanding is towards the end, the Jewish people will come back to Christianity. Jewish people in Israel will come back to Christianity. The two greatest populations of Jewish people are in the United States and in Israel, especially specifically within the United States. It's in New York City, places like New York City and Boca Raton, Florida, where I'm from. So I'm from Boca Raton, not from New York City, but here we go. And I just want to mention that because what's amazing about that is, think about this. The Jews dispersed in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. They dispersed all over the world. 1878 years later, in 1948, the Jewish state came back into life, came back to be. In the 19th century, people started to resurrect the Hebrew language, the ancient Hebrew language. And in Israel, people started speaking the Hebrew language. So it's very interesting because that is portended or predicted. The end times are predicted. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at it from one perspective, you'd say portended. You're pretty scared about the end times. As Christians, no, I don't necessarily want to be in that time period when it's going to be so horrible for a while there, when we have destruction by fire and all kinds of people having to wear numbers to be able to buy things. It sounds like an awful time. But we're seeing closer and closer signs of the end times even today. So here we go.
That's the most common view. Other Jews thought that the Messiah would be a cosmic figure who destroyed the forces of evil, God's enemies, and set up a kingdom here on earth, kind of a cosmic judge, one like a son of man, as in the book of Daniel. There are other Jews, the Jews who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls thought there were going to be two messiahs. One apparently was going to be like a political figure who would be subservient to the major messiah, who was a priest, who would interpret God's laws and would rule the people of God with a fist of iron. And so there are various views, but all of these views had in common the idea that the Messiah would be a great figure of grandeur and power who would overwhelm the enemy and set up and rule God's people. Christians, of course.
Jesus didn't come. Jesus came to, he said, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Jesus came as a Prince of Peace. Take a look at Isaiah 9:6 if you haven't looked at the forms that Jesus was going to come in. A wonderful counselor, mighty Father, Prince of Peace. Okay, so you've got several right there. So you've got very descriptive words to describe Jesus. And the idea of the Prince of Peace is again, speaking to the type of Messiah who is going to come. The suffering servant as well.
I've never said that because Jesus didn't do that.
Oh, I think I've said that wrong. So wonderful counselor, everlasting God. Wait, wonderful. I got to go back and look at that. Mighty Father, everlasting God, or everlasting Father, mighty God. I have to double check that. And Prince of Peace.
Jesus was crucified. And then they believed he got raised from the dead. And so Christians came up with this idea that the Messiah is not supposed to be any of those things. The Messiah is supposed to be somebody who dies and is raised. And then they turned to their Bible and they found passages that seem to say that about there's going to be some righteous person who suffers and then God vindicates, like Isaiah 53 or Psalm 20.
Okay, and I've talked a lot about Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. If you guys are new to this channel, please go and take a look at those verses. Isaiah 53 makes it quite clear that there is a suffering servant. Okay, the form of the suffering servant starts in Isaiah 52. So in Isaiah 52, we learn that he was going to be beaten beyond all recognition. It gives us a very good description of the crucifixion. It says he was despised by his own people. It says that he was led to the slaughter like a lamb. Okay, you get, of course, the Lamb of God taking away the sins of us. You saw that with the John the Baptist. But it also says that he would be suffering and he would die for our sins, for our transgressions. He would be pierced for our transgressions. Okay, you have to take a look at that. Now, I've gone into depth on how that cannot be anything but Jesus. It has to be a singular person because it doesn't make sense to say the nation of Israel is going to be pierced for Israel's transgressions. That doesn't make any sense. It's that he would be pierced for our transgressions. So it's really important you take a look at that. But then it says in Isaiah 53:11 that he will see the light. Okay, he will see his offspring. Well, who are his offspring? We are. We're his children. We're the children of God. And so we see that in Isaiah 53. Now, in Zechariah 12:10, he forgot to mention that. It speaks of how he's going to be pierced, how the firstborn would be pierced. Okay, and in Psalm 22, it says his hands and his feet would be pierced. Now, Psalms was written about 1,000 years before Jesus even walked the earth and hundreds of years before the crucifixion had even been invented. But yet it said he would be pierced. His hands and his feet would be pierced. It said in Psalm 22, he's going to be surrounded by these strong bulls of Bashan. They were going to divide up his clothes. This is very, very much representation of Jesus. Okay. We also know from other verses in the Psalms and from all over the Bible, we've got a lot of references to the suffering one taking on our sins. So here we go.
22, and there's all these verses most of your listeners will know about, and they claim that's talking about the Messiah, and that's where the idea of a suffering Messiah came from. Those passages, by the way, never talk about the Messiah.
See, he makes a big deal as if as if that's a really important point. Sorry, Bart, but no, that's not even an important point, because let's look at what the passages said. If I go over, I'll zip over to Isaiah 53. Now, let's just see what this says. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Many times in the Isaiah passage, it talks about the arm of the Lord and the right hand of God and the justice coming from that. It says he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. One of the things about the book of Isaiah are a lot of references to trees and the way that the trees in the first 39 books of Isaiah, it talks about how people were going to get judgment. There was going to be a judgment. People were going to, like trees, there were many trees. They were going to be pushed down, they were going to be knocked down, that kind of thing. They were going to be punished. And then in the last books of the Bible, the last 27 books of Isaiah, it talks about consolation and redemption and how the suffering servant is going to make right many of the sins of the past. Interestingly, this aligns quite clearly with the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament has 39 books, speaks about the way that the Jewish people were constantly making bad decisions, up and down, God's judgment. Then you talk about the righteous kings, the unrighteous kings, the righteous kings. We have all that kind of stuff all through the Old Testament. And then we get to the New Testament, and that's a testament of consolation and redemption and vicarious redemption for that matter. So here's it says, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. It's probably the only description of Jesus' looks in the Bible. Now, if you're a fan of the Shroud of Turin or you've done any investigative work on the Shroud of Turin, I will say you should probably look at my last few videos on the Shroud. For many, many years, I thought it was just a hoax. No more. No more. I think if you want to get an idea of what he looks like, you can easily go to the Shroud of Turin. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. This does not even speak closely to either a group of people in Israel, because some people in Israel are beautiful, or the country of Israel. Israel itself has many, many beautiful parts. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we hold him in low esteem. Okay, so of course we know that the stone that was the cornerstone, the stone that was rejected by the builders was made the cornerstone. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before a shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? Think about him when he was taken away. His apostles were hiding out while Jesus was being crucified, with the exception of John. And then there were women who were at the feet of Jesus when he was being crucified. Really interesting. Peter, the rock, was hiding out. Quite embarrassing, actually. For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people, he was punished. And then we see what happened next. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. He had to ask to bury Jesus. Jesus' family and friends weren't there to bury him. They probably didn't have the money to be able to afford a tomb in the first place. But Joseph was a very wealthy Jewish man, and he was a good Jewish man. And he asked Pontius Pilate for permission to remove Jesus from the cross. And when he did that, he wrapped him in some very expensive burial cloth. Okay, a very expensive burial cloth. If you look at the Shroud of Turin, that actually was a very expensive burial cloth. Very, very well made, very well constructed, made out of flax. And you can look at the fibers in that cloth and you can see the way it was woven in quite a sophisticated method. And I have looked at journals that talk about the weaving of that particular cloth and the weaving of the cloth that even goes back to hundreds of years before that. And it's very consistent with ancient cloths. In fact, it's made of flax. A lot of the stuff that was around in the Middle Ages, if you posit that the Shroud of Turin came out then, was made of cotton. So we've got flax all around the main portion of the Shroud of Turin. We've got little cotton added at the edges where people did some mending. And so sadly, the carbon dating that was done on the Shroud of Turin in the mid-'80s, unfortunately pulled from a little teeny weeny piece at the top of the shroud. And it had been a piece that had been mended probably in the Middle Ages. So the dating needs to be redone, and we need to get back into that. But anyway, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and the Lord makes his life an offering for sin. He will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Okay? Take a look at that. I hope you guys have concentrated on that, prayed on that, think about that. That is one of the verses that really cemented my views when I was returning to Christianity.
Oh yeah, read Isaiah 53 and look for the word Messiah sometime.
And that just sounds, I can't even comment. It just, Just because the word Messiah is not in Isaiah 53, therefore, I mean, this is just utter ridiculous reasoning.
That's not fair.
On the
So what?
another issue about the historical Jesus, I've seen atheists who would say, hey, I don't believe Jesus actually performed miracles, but I believe he was known as a miracle worker. So is your perspective that he was that's how he was known, like similar to way, like, you know, I would think of Benny Hinn. I don't think he's actually performing miracles, but I think he's known like that. Or is that would you say that's a later Christian invention?
I'm not sure whether it was going on during his lifetime or not. I wouldn't be surprised if it was going on during his lifetime. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened afterwards. You know, the problem today is that when we think about miracles, we have such a different conception of it from people in the ancient world. Because for us, we know about things like natural law. I mean, you know, whether you're a Newtonian or whether you follow Einstein, you've got this view of gravity that it always holds. It does not get violated. It's a law. And in the ancient world, they didn't think about it that way. It's like, you know, there wasn't. The ancient world actually didn't have a realm of the supernatural. This seems weird to us because we have, you know, we got the natural thing, we got the supernatural thing, and there's a miracle, it's the supernatural thing. But the ancient world, they didn't have this division. They didn't even have words for natural and supernatural in the same way. Whatever happens is what the gods want to happen.
I like the point here that Isaac Lyle-Hicker is making. He says, he isn't called Messiah the first time he's talked about. The first the person is called Messiah later down the line. First, he's called the seed. Yeah, the seed in Genesis. So we see the seed come, a woman's seed. The interesting thing in Genesis is they start alluding to the future possibility of somebody coming to crush the serpent. And of course, we know that happened. So, or that's going to happen. Part of it's going to happen. We've got, what's interesting in the Old Testament is a lot of times you'll see a prophecy that partially comes to life or partially is satisfied in ancient times or during other times. But then you see later on some other fulfillments, like the fact that Israel came back, for example, a modern time issue.
So if you got a miracle worker, some guys like, you know, God's making it happen. Well, you know, God makes the sun rise and makes, you know, allow this person to heal the sick. And so it's not categorically different the way it is for us. So I have no trouble with believing that people in Jesus' day, they certainly believed that other people were doing miracles, and they probably thought Jesus, I guess, maybe thought Jesus was.
What he's trying to do right there is he's trying to simplify he's trying to act, number one, that the people in ancient times had these sort of simple minds, and they thought that everything, the gods were causing everything, or God was causing everything. God caused the sun to rise, causes the moon to move, all that kind of stuff. So he's trying to act like they're sort of simpletons. But the simple fact is the type of miracles that Jesus was performing need to be noted. The idea of changing water to wine. You can't change water to wine. That's changing physical composition and cellular structure and everything else. The idea of walking on water. Now, the interesting thing, and the reason why the disciples were shocked when they saw Jesus walk on water is they said, who walks on water? Who walks on water? Well, that's a direct reference to the book of Job, where it says nobody but God walks on water. Only God can walk on water. And that is not something that they were seeing and would say that we would not call a miracle today. We would completely call a miracle. You're walking on water. You're obviously not being pulled down by gravity. You're able to control gravity. And so that speaks clearly to a miracle. Raising people from the dead. Now, he does make a good point here. He talks about the difference between resuscitation, which is like what Jesus did when he resuscitated Lazarus and Jairus' daughter and others, or when Paul resuscitated people, but they eventually died later. And the resurrection. And that's the idea that you're brought back to life and you go into eternity, but you don't die later here physically on the earth.
On the issue, since you've got the debate coming up next month on the resurrection, a couple issues related to the resurrection. So in order to rise from the dead, Jesus would need to be dead. So are you and Mike going to agree on that?
Well, I hope Mike hasn't changed his mind. Yes, Jesus is dead.
Okay.
Of course he was dead. Yes. We will agree. Unless he thinks he wasn't dead.
So this is good because it rules out one of the explanations of the crucifixion. So one of the explanations of the resurrection that people claim, they might claim these different theories. Some is Jesus had a twin, some is Jesus didn't really die. And here he's just ruling that out. So he doesn't offer us any explanation for what exactly we know surrounding the resurrection. Instead, he just sort of laughs it off and says, "Oh, we know that. We know he died, but we know what's going on in the Gospels. We see that kind of stuff, but it's doesn't." You'll see. Let's go.
So no disputing on death by crucifixion.
No.
So the dispute will be whether he was alive again later, obviously, right?
Well, the dispute. So I don't think Mike's going to argue that it was a near-death experience. Mm-hmm. So he's going to be arguing that it was a resurrection. So there's a difference between a near-death experience, or what used to be more commonly called a resuscitation. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between a resuscitation and a resurrection. A resurrection means the person doesn't die again. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of Jesus is not that he was brought back from the dead to live for another 20 years and then die. The way, say, Lazarus, for example, or Jairus' daughter, they would have died again. So the idea of a resurrection is kind of the whole package. He was dead, he was brought back to life and made immortal.
So since Jesus was dead, it seems like the early...
I want to address a point here made by Stupid Whore Energy. So she says this, she says, where did that go? And I just lost it. Oh, Jesus was thrown into a mass grave. We have no ancient evidence to suggest this. Okay, that is a proposition that was formed by Jesus deniers today, that he was put into a mass grave. Rather, we have plenty of evidence that it shows that Jesus' death and burial were consistent with Jewish customs. He had to remove from the cross, especially coming up with the Passover. The burial was also in the Gospels. It's quite clear that Joseph Arimathea buried him in his tomb. We have, going back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we've got where the ancients have pointed to that tomb being located. Okay, so you can go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You don't have anything on a mass grave. That's completely fabricated in recent times. It's ridiculous to believe that with no ancient evidence, zero ancient evidence.
Early Christians were convinced that he had risen from the dead. And one of the main issues here is that his disciples had some sort of experiences which they interpreted as seeing him post-mortem. So what is your perspective on that? Is that later myth, or were they hallucinating, or?
Well, I think some of them, I don't know. We don't have good records for any of this, unfortunately, because none of the people, none of the disciples who allegedly saw something have left us any records.
Which is completely wrong. I can't even imagine he says this stuff. I don't know how David keeps a straight face. And I also don't know how David doesn't even respond or address that, because I know David doesn't believe that. So you've got Matthew. Again, Matthew is the tax collector Matthew, who is one of the 12. You have Mark. Mark was a very good friend of Peter. Mark and Peter traveled together. And we also see that Mark was working with Mark was also working with Paul. Okay, so we've got the mention of John Mark, the son of Mary, who was mentioned in the portion of the New Testament written by Paul. So we've got a lot of that too. Then you have Luke. Luke was somebody who traveled with Paul. He started speaking of himself in the first person, starting around Acts 16. And Luke also was referenced by Paul as a good doctor and others, and he collected information. Luke didn't say that he was an eyewitness himself. He said he gathered the information from those who were. Same with Mark. Mark doesn't say he's an eyewitness himself, but he gathered the information from those who were. Then, of course, we get to John. John, there's a lot of internal evidence that John was a fisherman. He was the one who was the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, the sons of thunder. We have a lot of information that correlates to his idea of being a fisherman. John knew certain things that fishermen would know, like how many fish did they catch? They caught specifically 153. If you're not a fisherman, you're probably not going to be counting out the fish. And that's only referenced in the Gospel of John. So we also have, again, all of the early church fathers. Anyone who references these Gospels references it to those 4 authors. We don't have any ancient evidence pointing to anybody else. So if you posit that, you're positing a modern ancient trope. Okay, it's ridiculous. Then we know, of course, that Luke also wrote Acts, because he makes it clear at the beginning that he wrote it to his dear Theophilus. It was the first book was Luke, the second book was Acts. We know that Paul, who, if you just join me, Paul didn't just see Jesus on the road to Damascus. Go to Acts 23:11. You'll be surprised that Jesus appeared to Paul, not just that time, but another time as well. He appeared to Paul while Paul was in his ministry. So we have Paul as an eyewitness. Then Paul, even in 1 Corinthians, talks about how Jesus first appeared to Peter. But we actually know from the 4 Gospels he first appeared to women, but women's testimony wasn't considered credible back then. First he appeared to Mary Magdalene, then to the women, then to Peter, then to the apostles. Okay, he appeared to Peter individually. That's also mentioned in the book of Luke. Then he appeared to the 500, some of whom were awake and some of whom were sleeping. That's mentioned because Paul can get verification that he appeared. So he had appeared to Peter, appeared to the 12, appeared to the 500. Then he appeared to his brother James. Then he appeared to Paul, okay? And he appeared to Paul multiple times. It wasn't just the one time on the road to Damascus. So they're witnesses, of course. And then we've got James and Jude. They have books in the Bible. Guess what? Those two are Jesus' half-brothers. They wrote there. Peter wrote. Got the Peter also was in there. So we've got references to this. 1 Peter, 2 Peter. We've got those references. Now, people can make whatever assertions they want, but that right there is pretty solid evidence that we've got the early ancient witnesses, the eyewitnesses, or people who knew the eyewitnesses. That was how these particular books came into the canon. You had to be an eyewitness or known the eyewitness, and that's exactly how it was put together. We wanted the earliest, most important information.
And so we don't have them saying it.
I want to say hi to other people in the chat that I just noticed coming in here. So Evidence and Reason, Stupid Horror Energy, Iron Matt, Brandon. Great to see you guys. Always good to see you. So here we go.
The closest thing we have is Paul, who probably converted 3 years later. Is usually what people suggest based on doing Pauline chronology is a little bit complicated, but Paul does date something, 3 years later I did this, 12 years, that kind of thing. And when you add it all together, it looks like if Jesus died, say in the year 30, then it looks like Paul could.
I don't think Jesus died in the year 30. I've found scholarly evidence that suggests that it's very consistent with Jesus dying in the year 33. Now, that also speaks to when Jesus' birthday is. And what's interesting about that is I've seen estimates anywhere between 2 BC and 1 AD, and I find that's much more believable and credible given the evidence that I've discovered from Josephus and others, and many scholarly writings today, like from Steinman 2009, that point to a later proposal than what some people have used with the Schur's hypothesis, that hypothesized that Jesus' birth was somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. If you look at the evidence of what occurred back then, and you look at the things that Josephus said about an eclipse occurring, and the timing of the eclipse and the timing of the Passover and a lot of this kind of stuff. I don't want to get into details now because I've made videos on this, but you will find that we have a lot of good evidence to suggest not to reject Schur's hypothesis and accept this earlier date, somewhere between 3 and 2 BC. So here we go.
Converted in the year 33. And Paul, I think certainly had a vision of Jesus. He thought, by vision, I don't mean it's a hallucination. I mean, he saw something. Mm-hmm. And either it was a hallucination, in other words, the thing wasn't there, or it really was Jesus. But either way, he saw something. And some of the earlier disciples did too. That's why they believed in the resurrection. They absolutely didn't believe because of an empty tomb. The New Testament is clear on this. They believed because they saw Jesus. And I think some of them absolutely saw. I doubt if all 11 did, but my guess is that a couple of them did. Maybe Peter, maybe Mary Magdalene.
See, this is an agnostic. How can he say this? It's so funny. He realizes maybe Peter saw him, maybe Mary Magdalene did. How do you deal with this information if you're an agnostic? He acknowledges the fact from all of his studies, his academic career, that these people saw Jesus, and maybe he won't acknowledge that all of them did. He says maybe some of them did. Next step, Bart, come on. If we have the resurrection, we can show that we have authenticity of the Christian religion and that Jesus is divine.
They're the ones who were first credited with seeing Jesus. And so I think they had some kind of visionary experience. And Christians would say, well, they saw Jesus, he appeared. And non-Christians would say, well, they had hallucinations. But either way, I think they saw something that convinced them that Jesus was raised. Yes.
Okay, so I'm guessing that a lot of the debate's going to come down to whether we should take whatever those experiences were seriously.
I take them deadly seriously.
Oh, okay.
I think they saw something.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So they saw something, and the question is, did they see the risen Jesus?
I love this. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to review this video, because I find it so fascinating that Bart acknowledges that they saw something. Now, let's remember something. Hallucinations are like dreams. They're internal. You don't share them, okay? So there's no shared hallucination of Jesus. That's not being reported here. We have individual appearances to individual people like Peter and James and Paul. We have group experiences when Jesus appeared to the 12 a couple of times. First, when the doubting Thomas wasn't there, and the second time when Thomas was there. And of course, he appeared to 500. And we've got that too. And so he appears in groups, he appears individually, he appears over a period of 40 days and in different places. So I don't know how you deal with that if you're non-Christian. If you guys have looked into the information, it's pretty compelling. So yeah, let's see. SJ, do you give any credence to Heiser's belief that Jesus' birth was on September 11th? I personally don't, but it's still interesting. Yeah, Heiser, I like Michael Heiser. I will just mention, I hope he's doing well. Last I heard, he was battling cancer, so I hope that everything's going okay for him. I think that that's very possible. I think it's super interesting. It aligns with Revelation 12 and the constellations and Virgo and a lot of that kind of stuff. And so he looks at the stars and the constellations and asks the question of why were the Magi looking at the stars and following the star to get to where Jesus was at the time when they showed up. Now, I lay out how Matthew and Luke can be taken together. You first are supposed to read Luke, then you read Matthew, and it can go right there in chronological order. The interesting thing that people don't realize, and especially in these old scenes of the manger, one of the things people don't realize is when the Magi appeared, they didn't appear at the same time as the shepherds. The shepherds appeared when Jesus was just born, when he was in Bethlehem, and he was definitely inside of this sort of manger, inside of a hotel. They didn't have a room at a hotel, so he was in the barn or the shed or whatever it was. And then the Magi appeared when Jesus was away. Now, he's reported at this point as being a young child within 2 years. That's why Herod said all children under 2 years. Okay, so the Magi appeared after they had the signs in the sky. And Michael Heiser's position goes back to what the signs in the sky said at that time. You can go back now with modern astronomers can reconstruct exactly how the sky appeared in ancient history.
But that'd be
I want to say hi to Craig Reed too, and I like this. Evidence and Reason says they saw something. Best part of the show. Yes.
That'd be the dispute, or more likely, can we know that what they saw was the risen Jesus? Would that be more accurate?
I absolutely think they believe they saw the risen Jesus.
Clip that. Somebody clip that. And then let's get to the next statement.
That doesn't mean they saw the risen Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that doesn't mean they saw. So he says they believe they saw the risen Jesus. He reports, he admits, or he acknowledges that multiple people saw something. Okay, so here we go.
I mean, I know all sorts of people who've seen the Blessed Virgin Mary lately. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they did, but they're convinced they did.
All right. Now, so you mentioned Paul. What about James? So if you just go with the Gospels, doesn't look like James had much confidence in his brother during that time, but later becomes an apostle. So what's your perspective there?
I don't think we know. I think he certainly came to believe Jesus was raised from the dead. And so it's quite remarkable, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, that Jesus' own brother believed he got raised from the dead. I mean, just think about that for a second. Think about your own siblings for a while. Wow, really? My siblings don't think I'm the son of God.
I hope he sounds like this in his class because he's making a pretty good case. And I can see that little smirk kind of on David's face. I think he might think the same thing. He's got, oh gosh, your own brother. Think about that. I mean, my brothers would never, ever think I'm at any, just think about that. They know you from the very beginning. They know you from when you were young and you were saying silly things and doing dumb things, and they know you all that time. And the interesting thing is that they would know if he's actually a sinner, okay? But they attested to him being the Son of God, to being divine, and we see that right in the book of James. So just go to the book of James, go to the book of Jude, and you're going to see that exact thing reported.
I tell you that. And so so something remarkable must have happened. It doesn't mean that necessarily he had a personal experience. Paul says he did. And Paul knew him. Which, by the way, throws a bit of a monkey wrench in the mythicist argument that Jesus didn't exist.
That's true.
Paul knows his brother.
Yeah.
You know, if Jesus didn't exist, you would think his brother would know about it. It's like, really?
Yeah.
So, but I think James, either people like Peter convinced him that they saw him, or he himself had an experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the two options.
Mm-hmm. And too bad the mythers weren't there to to tell James that his brother didn't exist.
I know.
Now, on to some other issues.
Let's not forget that James also was known to Paul. James was known to Paul. Paul had met James. Paul, James, and Peter, they'd all known each other. And so we've got a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And so would Paul actually get up and write 1 Corinthians 15, knowing James? And both James and Paul were probably killed right around the same time in the 60s, early 60s. And so would he get up there and write 1 Corinthians 15 much earlier than that, saying that Jesus appeared to James? If he's lying that Jesus appeared to James, 1 Corinthians 15 is a creed. James could have said, no, he didn't appear to me. What are you talking about? Peter told me he appeared to him. So there's none of that. This is fabricated. Now, even Dr. Ehrman acknowledges that 1 Corinthians 15 is a very, very early creed. It was something memorized by the church members way back in the 30s. Okay, way back in the 30s. And right in 1 Corinthians 15, it says that he appeared to James. So I don't know why Ehrman would not acknowledge that.
On the borderline of Islam and Christianity, we've got Paul, whom you've talked about, and you've got Muhammad, whom you've talked about. Neither one of these guys apparently knew Jesus when he had his earthly ministry. Both of them claim to have received revelations, and both of them went around talking a lot about Jesus. So who would you go with if you had to pick someone talking about Jesus?
Between Paul and Muhammad?
Yeah, as a source.
I mean, Muhammad is 500 years later.
Yeah.
And so I don't think anybody claims Muhammad knew Jesus. Yeah. Nobody claims Paul knew Jesus. I mean, at least they shouldn't claim that. I mean, Paul didn't. Paul.
Okay, so while he's kind of trying to figure out what he wants to say here, Paul actually did know Jesus, because he might not have known Jesus while Jesus walked the earth and prior to the crucifixion. However, he did know Jesus afterwards. So he knew Jesus because Jesus appeared to him. Also, he said that everything that he wrote down was God breathed by Jesus. Jesus told him what to write down. So if you go and you read his letters, or his book to the Romans, or his book to the Corinthians, or any of those kind of things, you're going to find that he's writing what he says Jesus told him to write. And so clearly he had a pretty good knowledge of Jesus and understanding of Jesus. So here we go. Let's see. Now, this is the point when Bart just starts saying that everything is false. And so I'm not going to go too much longer after this, because it just gets a little silly.
He's not from Israel. In the book of Acts, Paul...
So we know that Paul's from Tarsus, and he's a Roman citizen.
Paul is said to have studied with Gamaliel in Israel, but I don't believe that's true.
Okay, so he doesn't believe what's written in the book of Acts. So here's where he starts saying that he just doesn't believe it. He doesn't give us reason why he doesn't believe it. It just, of course, is something that bugs him. He's trying to discount or discredit Paul.
The book of Acts says he's from Tarsus. I doubt if that's true, too. And he says he's a Roman citizen. I doubt if that's true. I mean, there are reasons for doubting all of these things. But he doesn't say so himself. He says none of that. He doesn't say that. He says nothing about being educated in Jerusalem, and he doesn't give any good evidence of even knowing Hebrew.
You might forget, but Paul actually spoke in Hebrew several times. He spoke in Hebrew when he addressed the Sanhedrin. Okay, so he said brothers in Hebrew. He spoke the whole thing out in Hebrew. He testified in Hebrew. So to say that he didn't know Hebrew is just silly. It's just, it comes without any sort of basis. It's the kind of thing that it very, very much annoys me about biblical scholars who claim to have some sort of credibility. And then they go and they start trying to say that everything we see in the Gospels is not true. And so he's not giving us any backing there. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming in here today. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll like and subscribe. I will try to get back on here next week. I'm working on getting an expert from Australia to come on my channel. He is a doctor, and a medical doctor, actually. And I wanted him to come on my channel because I heard something that he said on another person's channel on the Shroud of Turin. Now, I've been going back and forth in emails with him, but I haven't heard from him in a while. So worst case scenario is I will actually find that video that I watched before, and I will showcase it here because it's very, very good. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you like, subscribe, do come again. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, everybody in here. WD, I see you there too. Isaac and Brandon, and let's go, Brandon. It's like Evidence and Reasons, all good people. So you guys, please like, subscribe, do come back again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Amen. Have a good one.